last night. Did we sleep together? The question was not spoken loudly. There was no shouting, no tears. Yet it hung in the small kitchen like an invisible blade, just waiting to fall. Ethan Miller stood frozen, both hands gripping the edge of the kitchen table as if he let go, the entire world would collapse. Morning sunlight slanted through the window, illuminating the pale face of the woman standing across from him, the woman he had called boss for the past 4 years. She wasn't wearing her business suit. She didn't have that familiar, cold authority. She was just a woman in an oversized borrowed t-shirt, hair tied up hastily, eyes filled with confusion, like someone who had just woken up in the middle of a nightmare and couldn't remember how she had entered it. 7 words. Just 7 words. But to Ethan, they carried the weight of a complete sentence. He wasn't panicking because he feared being accused of something. He wasn't trembling because he feared losing his job. He wasn't even afraid of being misunderstood. What made his heart pound out of control was that he didn't know which answer would cause more damage. If she believed something had happened, his honor could be shattered. But if she was afraid that it had happened, then perhaps, deep down, he was no longer seen as a human being, but only as a mistake that needed to be avoided. Ethan had thought he had already endured enough loss to be unshakable. 3 years earlier, he had buried his wife on a cold, rainy afternoon. From that day on, he learned to live by discipline, responsibility, and silence. He did not allow himself to dream. He did not allow himself to be weak. He did not allow himself to love again. His life was reduced to rushed mornings, his daughter's lunchbox, and late nights sitting alone in a quiet house. He believed that being a good father was enough, that the other parts of him, manhood, desire, longing, belonged to the past. Until that morning. Until that question. Did we sleep together last night? No one in that kitchen knew that this moment would not only decide what had happened the night before, but it would also decide who Ethan would be for the rest of his life. And sometimes, the questions that seem the most harmless, these are the very ones that begin to change an entire lifetime. Before that morning happened, before 7 short words shook his entire world, Ethan Miller was just a man trying to survive one day at a time. He was 38 years old. He lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where every house looked so similar that you could easily walk into the wrong one without realizing it. A safe place. A place good enough for children. And for Ethan, that was enough. 3 years earlier, he hadn't chosen to become a single father. Life had forced him into it. His wife, the woman who had once filled this house with laughter, was gone after a sudden car accident. No final words, no time to prepare, only a void left behind, one that no financial plan or carefully structured schedule could ever fill. From that day on, Ethan learned to live with the bare minimum. He woke up earlier than usual, cooked breakfast, packed school bags, reminded his daughter to bring a jacket. His life became a chain of tasks, leaving no room for excess emotion. His 8-year-old daughter, Mia, was the center of every decision he made. Every morning, as she tied her shoelaces, Ethan stood behind her, watching in silence. He never said it out loud, but the same question always echoed in his mind. Have I done enough? At work, Ethan was the kind of employee every manager wanted to keep. Quiet, undemanding, always on time, always finishes his tasks. He arrived earlier than everyone else, left later than everyone else, and never once complained about sudden overtime. Not because he loved the job that much, but because he couldn't afford to lose it. That job was what kept his and his daughter's lives from collapsing. It was health insurance. It was tuition fees. It was the fragile stability he had sacrificed so much to protect. Ethan once had other dreams. He had wanted to travel. He had wanted to change jobs. He had wanted to live more slowly. But all of those things were carefully set aside in a corner he rarely touched, like old photographs kept in a drawer he wasn't ready to open. He didn't allow himself to linger too long on memories of his late wife. He didn't allow himself to think about dating. He didn't allow himself to be soft. Because if he fell apart, there would be no one to pick up his daughter. Ethan wasn't bitter. He didn't blame life. He simply chose silent acceptance. And it was that silence, that wordless sacrifice, that slowly made him forget something essential. That he was not only a father, not only a reliable employee, he was still a human being. And the human heart, no matter how tightly it is locked away, still needs at some point to be seen, understood, and loved. That Friday began like any other, rushed, orderly, and filled with tasks that had to be completed before deadlines. On Ethan's computer screen, numbers flickered nonstop. A tense business quarter had just closed. A major contract had just been signed. And at the far end of the office, a lively atmosphere was already rising like a wave. The company was throwing a celebration, a rooftop bar in the city center, free drinks, full attendance from senior leadership. "Come on, just one drink," a coworker said, half joking, half serious. "You deserve it." Ethan smiled politely and shook his head. Tonight, Mia had a performance at school. It wasn't a big event, no grand stage lights, just a small auditorium, simple costumes, and still awkward dance steps. However, for Mia, it was a significant moment. And for Ethan, it was a promise. He had told her he would sit in the front row. He had promised. In Ethan's mind, everything was clear. Work could wait. His daughter could not. Over. The past 3 years, he had learned one thing. There are moments that, once missed, never come back. Until his phone vibrated. A message from the elderly neighbor, the woman who occasionally helped watch Mia after school. She said she would take the girl early, buy her an ice cream, and help her get ready. Then came one small line, seemingly casual. "You can stop by the company for a bit, no need to rush." Ethan read the message again and again. A bit. Not the whole evening. Just enough time to shake hands, say thank you, and then leave. In that moment, he convinced himself with very reasonable explanations. He owed Rachel, the boss who had protected his flexible schedule throughout those difficult years, a personal word of thanks. He also didn't want to be seen as someone who was always absent, always separating himself from the team. And above all, he believed he could fulfill both roles. He just needed to manage the timing carefully. He just needed not to stay too long. Ethan put on his jacket and left the office, telling himself he was doing the right thing. But a vague sensation crept into his chest, a very faint unease, difficult to name. Like stepping out of the house without checking the lock, even though you know the chances of something going wrong are slim. On the way to the party, he checked his watch one more time. Everything was still under control. At least, that's what he thought. He didn't know that within just a few hours, the very concept of control would slip entirely out of his hands. And the promise to his daughter, though not yet broken, had already begun to waver the moment he stepped onto that brightly lit rooftop. The party unfolded exactly as Ethan had imagined, loud, brightly lit, and slightly over the top. City lights stretched out below the building, shimmering like a promise of better things he rarely allowed himself to think about. Music thudded against his chest. Laughter rose in clusters. Glasses were lifted high amid congratulatory handshakes. Ethan moved slowly, kept his distance, and found himself a corner that was polite enough to stand in. He planned to stay exactly 30 minutes, no more. Just long enough to show his face, say thank you, and leave before everything slipped off course. And then he saw Rachel. Not the usual Rachel, the woman with the sharp gaze, precise words, and a presence that could silence an entire meeting room the moment she spoke. Tonight, she stood by the bar in a simple black dress, her hair worn loose, a tired but genuine smile on her face. She looked strangely approachable. "You came," Rachel said when she saw Ethan, her voice softer than usual.
"I thought you wouldn't. Just for a bit," Ethan replied. "I wanted to thank you for everything."
Rachel nodded and signaled to the bartender. A glass was slid toward him. Ethan hesitated, then took it, not because he wanted to drink, but because he didn't want to interrupt this rare moment. A moment without emails, without deadlines, without hierarchy. They talked about work, then about plans for the department. Rachel spoke with a passion Ethan rarely heard in formal meetings. Her voice slowed, her eyes softened, and somewhere between those seemingly harmless conversations, a pause appeared. Neither of them rushed to fill it. Maybe it was the alcohol, maybe it was the long day, or maybe it was because they were both exhausted from constantly having to be strong. Ethan couldn't remember when he started talking about his wife. He only knew that by the time he realized it, the conversation had gone too far. "Next month makes 3 years, he said quietly. "Sometimes, in the morning, I still reach out to the other side of the bed." Rachel didn't speak right away. She looked at him for a long moment, as if seeing for the first time the person behind the role of the model employee. Then she exhaled softly. "My divorce papers were signed yesterday," she said. 12 years. Ended in a single afternoon. There were no tears, no anger, just emptiness, finally named. In that moment, the city lights seemed to blur. The music faded into the distance. All that remained were two people standing across from each other, not boss and employee, but two individuals who had just lost a part of their lives. Ethan glanced at his watch. Time had passed faster than he expected, and somewhere deep inside, he felt something with striking clarity. He had stepped into territory that was no longer safe, a place where just one more step could change everything in ways no one could foresee. Ethan realized something was wrong the moment Rachel stood up. She rose too quickly. The glass in front of her had been empty for some time, and as she took a step, her ankle buckled slightly, like a belated warning. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, more instinct than thought. "I'm fine," Rachel replied, but her voice no longer sounded certain. She smiled, a strained smile, trying to hold on to the image she had long been accustomed to wearing. "I just need a little air." But when she took another step, Ethan had to reach out and steady her by the elbow. In that moment, he felt her weight clearly, not just a body losing balance, but an entire person who had just fallen from her last support. Several eyes at the party began to turn toward them, curious glances, whispers that could form at any moment. Rachel noticed it before Ethan did. She leaned closer to him, her voice lowered to almost a plea. "Don't call a car. I don't want anyone to see me like this. Especially my team." Ethan glanced at his watch. In less than 20 minutes, Mia would be stepping onto the stage. In his mind, everything collided at once. The image of his daughter in her performance outfit, the promise he had made, and the woman leaning against him, a woman who, just hours earlier, had been the embodiment of absolute control. He could leave right now. He could hand Rachel over to another colleague. He could say it wasn't his responsibility. No one would blame him if he did. But Ethan knew that if he turned away, he would carry that feeling with him for a long time. A feeling that had appeared once before in his life, when he stood helplessly watching an ambulance take his wife away, knowing that there are moments you are not allowed to miss. He stepped outside with Rachel. The cold night air made her shiver, but it didn't make her any more alert. She leaned fully against him, her professional armor completely gone. "No taxis," she murmured. "I don't want..."
don't want anyone to remember me like this.
Ethan closed his eyes for a very brief moment. Then he took out his phone. The call was quick. His voice was low and urgent, carrying an unmistakable trace of guilt. He apologized. He explained. He asked for help. And on the other end of the line, another kind person agreed to keep his promise to his daughter for him, though no one could ever fully replace him. When he ended the call, Ethan knew he had made a choice. Not an easy choice, not a perfect choice, but the only choice he could live with afterwards. He opened the car door and helped Rachel into the passenger seat. "Let me take you somewhere safe," he said. And in that moment, Ethan understood something clearly. There are acts of kindness that no one ever witnesses, yet they are the very things that shape who we become. The car rolled out of the parking lot in silence. The city gradually fell away behind them, giving way to familiar suburban roads where streetlights were fewer and darkness stretched longer. Rachel sat quietly in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window, her unfocused gaze following the streaks of light rushing past as if they no longer had anything to do with her. Ethan drove more slowly than usual, not because the road was slick or because he was tired, but because he was trying to keep this moment from sliding in the wrong direction. He didn't say much. Neither did she. The silence between them wasn't heavy, but fragile. One poorly timed sentence would have been enough to shatter it. When the car stopped in front of Rachel's house, she began rummaging through her handbag with growing panic. Wallet, phone, lipstick, but no keys. "I must have left them at the bar," she said, her voice trembling as if she had just realized she'd lost more than a set of keys. "I can't go back there." Ethan glanced at his watch. Mia's performance had already begun. For a moment he stood at another crossroads, but this time he didn't need to deliberate long. The decision had already been made, back when he opened the car door for her. "You can stay at my place for now," he said, "just for tonight. We'll figure things out in the morning." Rachel looked up at him, her eyes a mixture of embarrassment and relief. She nodded, saying nothing more. Ethan's house was quiet when they stepped inside. No music, no laughter. Just the familiar scent of a small household, clean, warm, and orderly. He helped her sit down on the sofa, placed a glass of water on the table, and set out a few painkillers. Every movement was slow, deliberate, maintaining distance, as if he were walking along an invisible line. He wrote a small note and placed it beside the glass, just a few short lines explaining where she was and why. Not because he feared being misunderstood, but because he wanted her to feel at ease when she woke up. Then he put on his jacket and returned to the car. He arrived at the school just as the performance was nearing its end. The auditorium lights were softer than he had expected. Mia was standing in the back row, her face lighting up when she saw him quietly slip inside. She ran to him after the show, her skirt still spinning lightly with each step. "Did you see me, Dad?" Mia asked, her eyes shining. Ethan held her tightly. He told her she had been wonderful. He told her he was proud. But when Mia asked about the solo he had missed, he couldn't answer right away. Some apologies can't be made whole with explanations. When they returned home, Rachel was still sleeping soundly on the sofa. Ethan pulled another blanket over her, then led Mia upstairs. He told a bedtime story as he did every night, his voice even, trying to keep everything looking as though nothing unusual had happened. But when the house fell silent, Ethan sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. He knew that tonight no one had witnessed him. No one had taken note. No one had offered praise. And it was precisely in the absence of any watching eyes that his character was tested most clearly. Morning came earlier than Ethan expected. The familiar sound of a cartoon played from the living room, something he had heard hundreds of times, but that morning it made him jolt. For a moment he forgot everything. Then memory rushed back, clear and sharp enough to make him sit up straight. There was someone else in the house. Ethan hurriedly changed his shirt and went downstairs to the kitchen. Mia was sitting in front of her tablet, legs swinging to the rhythm of the cartoon music, entirely at ease. A child's world kept turning, untouched by the tensions of adults. He was pouring coffee when he heard footsteps on the stairs. Rachel appeared in the kitchen doorway. The image from the night before was gone. No makeup, none of her usual sharpness. Just a woman in an old t-shirt, hair tied back, face bare, and unexpectedly vulnerable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan spoke first, his voice so calm it surprised even him. "Good morning." Rachel nodded, as if trying to confirm that she wasn't dreaming. Her eyes moved around the kitchen, then settled on Mia. Ethan introduced them with the simplest possible words, nothing extra, nothing missing. Mia looked at Rachel with a child's innocent curiosity, asked a few polite questions, then quickly returned to her own world. Only when the door to the study closed behind them did Rachel finally let out a breath. "I'm very sorry," she said immediately, her voice trembling slightly. "What happened last night? It was completely inappropriate. I put you in a situation you never should have been in." Ethan shook his head. He said everyone had moments of weakness and that it was over now. Rachel looked around the small room, the family photos, the children's drawings pinned to the board. Her gaze stopped on an old picture. Ethan and his late wife both smiling brightly at the camera. "She's very beautiful," Rachel said softly. "Yes," Ethan replied. His chest tightened with a familiar ache. Rachel turned back to face him. This time her voice was more serious. No circling, no avoidance. "Ethan, did we sleep together last night?" The question fell into the room like a heavy object. Ethan didn't need to think, didn't need to weigh his words. "No," he said firmly. "Never." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment as if releasing an invisible burden. When she opened them, the relief was obvious, too obvious. And that was what hurt Ethan. Not because he had been doubted, but because he realized the idea that it might have happened had frightened her. He understood, he respected it, but deep inside, some part of him, the part that had been silent for 3 years, quietly cracked. In that moment, Ethan realized that question was not only about last night, but also about the night before. It was asking who he had become, and whether, in the eyes of others, he was still seen as a man. After Rachel left, the house returned to its familiar quiet. Too quiet. The door closed so softly it was almost soundless, yet inside Ethan, the echo of that morning continued to pulse at a slow, steady rhythm. He stood alone in the kitchen, one hand resting on the cold countertop, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold without him noticing. Everything had been resolved. No misunderstanding, no complications, no consequences. At least, on the surface. Rachel had returned to her proper place, a professional boss, someone who knew how to keep distance, how to close a door that had briefly opened. She had left with thanks, with perfect courtesy, with everything necessary to treat the night as though it had never existed. And Ethan should have done the same. But something in him refused to return to its former state. All morning, while dropping Mia off at school, while sitting behind the wheel in the familiar stream of traffic, while returning to his desk and the numbers that once made him feel safe, Ethan realized he could no longer focus the way he used to. Not because he was tired, but because that question was still there in his mind. Not repeating itself in words, just smoldering, persistent. He was used to being seen as a good father, a reliable employee, a man who didn't cause trouble. But when had those labels quietly taken something else from him? For 3 years, Ethan had built his life like a sealed house, stable, orderly, letting no strong emotions inside. He had called it maturity, responsibility, necessary sacrifice. Until that morning happened. Until he saw the relief in Rachel's eyes and realized that, in the eyes of others, He was no longer seen as a possibility, but as a boundary to be avoided. That truth didn't make him angry. It didn't fill him with resentment. It simply made him sad. Not because he wanted something to happen, but because he realized he had been shrinking himself for too long, to the point where he had forgotten he still had the right to desire, to feel, to be loved as a whole man. In the days that followed, everything continued as usual. Work, Mia's school schedule, simple dinners. But Ethan began to notice minimal changes, things he had once overlooked or deliberately ignored. He found himself lingering a little longer in front of the mirror in the morning. He found himself smiling when Mia told him stories about school instead of just listening out of habit. And sometimes, very rarely, he allowed himself to think about the future, not with anxiety, but with a fragile glimmer of hope. Ethan didn't yet know what would come next. He wasn't rushing to find answers, but he knew one thing for sure. That question from that morning had not broken him. It had only revealed a necessary crack so that light could finally find its way in. The message arrived on a very ordinary afternoon. No subject line, no long explanation. Just a single sentence accompanied by a clearly felt hesitation between the words. This weekend, would you and Mia like to go get ice cream? No alcohol, I promise. Ethan stared at the phone screen longer than necessary. It wasn't a work invitation. It wasn't a social obligation. And it didn't carry any pressure. It was simply an invitation. Deeply human. He didn't reply right away, not because he was hesitant, but because he was listening to himself, something he hadn't done in many years. Finally, he sent back a short message. Mia would love that. I would too. That evening, they met at a small ice cream shop near the park, a place where no one cared about job titles, no one asked about deadlines, and no one needed to appear strong. Mia was the first to break the distance. She talked non-stop about school, her recent performance, and small things that were simple yet real. Rachel listened. Not the polite kind of listening, but listening with her eyes, with her smile, with questions that made Mia light up from being truly seen. Ethan realized it before he could put it into words. Rachel wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply there. There were no intimate gestures, no words that crossed boundaries, just three people walking slowly through the park, each carrying a piece of their past, and for the first time, no one was in a hurry to hide it. The meetings that followed happened so naturally that Ethan didn't notice when they became routine. Ice cream on Saturdays, the children's museum on a rainy afternoon, simple picnics where Mia ran around while the two adults sat beside each other in a comfortable silence. Rachel didn't enter their lives with loud changes. She didn't push in. She didn't take over. She simply existed quietly, at the right moments, just enough. One night, as Ethan tucked Mia into bed, she suddenly said very softly, "She makes you smile, like Mom used to." Ethan didn't answer right away. He just sat there, his hand resting on her back, feeling her breathing slowly even out. In his chest, something tightened, but it didn't hurt. It was warm and real. He realized then that this connection wasn't built on blazing passion or grand promises. It was growing from patience, from respect, from choosing to stay even when nothing was guaranteed. No one was in a hurry to name it, but Ethan knew, and perhaps Rachel did too, that something was taking shape between them. Not to fill an old void, but to open a new space where both of them could finally be themselves. 6 months after that fateful morning, Ethan sat across from Rachel in a small restaurant overlooking the city. No glaring lights, no loud music, just the soft clink of cutlery against plates, and a silence safe enough for people to speak their most actual thoughts. Rachel was the first to speak. She placed her hand over Ethan's, not hurried, not hesitant. "That day, when I asked you that question," she said slowly, "I wasn't afraid of the answer because I didn't want it to be true." She paused and took a deep breath. "I was afraid because I thought I had ruined something good before it even had the chance to begin." Ethan didn't respond right away. He looked at their hands resting side by side, a tiny moment, yet one that carried an entire journey of loss, silence, and courage. "Sarah will always be a part of me," he finally said. "But I've learned that the human heart isn't something that only has room for love once." Rachel smiled, not a triumphant smile, but the smile of someone who had finally allowed herself to believe again. A year later, they were married in a simple ceremony. No extravagance, no display, just the people closest to them, and Mia in a little floral dress, scattering petals down the aisle with the pure joy of a child who knew her world had become safe again. Ethan stood there, holding Rachel's hand, and realized this. If that year he hadn't stopped, if he hadn't chosen to do the right thing when no one was watching, if he hadn't been hurt by a question that seemed accidental, then perhaps he would never have truly lived again, in the truest sense of the word. Life doesn't always change through big decisions. Sometimes it shifts course because of a single question, a single moment, a quiet choice between what is right and what is easy. There are things that seem to break us, but in truth, they are only unlocking a door we locked ourselves for far too long. And if this story made you slow down for a beat, made you think of a moment you once missed, or a kind choice you quietly made, please help spread it. Share it with someone who needs a gentle kind of faith. And comment, which moment in your life changed you in a way you never expected? Subscribe to Deep Life Tales, where real-life stories are told through listening, and where together we remember. Sometimes, the very thing that hurts us the most is the thing that leads us back to who we truly are.